Hello, everybody. My name is Liz Twist from the National Foundation for Educational Research, and I'm very pleased to be able to speak to you today. In this short talk, I'm going to first of all introduce myself very briefly and the organisation that I work for, the National Foundation for Educational Research. Then I will talk about how the UK and particularly the education system responded to the challenges of the pandemic. Then a little bit specifically about some research that NFER has undertaken, and then the implications of that research for teaching, and this has a focus on reading in particular. So that's my quick outline. As I said, my name is Liz Twist. I'm Head of Assessment Research and Product Development at NFER. I was in a former life a teacher, but I've been with the NFER for 25 years now. So the longest part of my working life has been as an assessment researcher. That's what I do. As I said, I work for the National Foundation for Educational Research, known as NFER. We work across the UK and we work internationally. Our head office is in Slough, which is near Heathrow Airport in London. And we also have an office in the north of England in York. So NFER is one of the oldest educational organisations in the UK. We were founded after the Second World War, when there was a lot of reform happening to health and education as the country was being rebuilt. We're a not-for-profit, we're a registered charity. Any surplus we make is reinvested in our work. And we had our 75th birthday last year. We've never been part of any government departments or education ministries. So quite unusually in the UK, or in England, in fact, we were involved in the national assessments, but under contract to the ministry, rather than being a part of the ministry, the Department of Education. And our aim is to improve education and learning and the lives of learners by providing evidence. Our driver is to provide the evidence that people can use to form policy about education. So we research and create the evidence, we analyse big data sets, and we have an information centre that looks at the evidence produced by others and disseminates it and organises it and so on. And as I mentioned, we work across the UK and internationally, and assessment is the largest area of work that we undertake. So a little bit about the pandemic in the UK. So along with many countries, there was an enormous shock, I think, in the spring of 2020, when what had been really unthinkable happened and we were put into a lockdown. As you can imagine, for established democracies, this was completely unheard of and unexpected. In the first lockdown in March 2020, schools closed for the majority of their pupils. The exceptions were the children of what we termed key workers could attend school, and key workers were people, as the name suggests, whose roles were critical to keep the country running. So that included teachers, but it included people who worked for the National Health Service. It included some people who worked for critical industries, but most children did not attend school for 14 weeks. The vast majority did not attend school for 14 weeks. There were some, what we termed vulnerable children, could attend, and they were children who the schools considered were at risk if they were not being monitored closely by their schools. And what was also clear in March 2020 was that there was a lot of variation in how schools were able to offer or not remote teaching, virtual lessons. Some schools were much better able to do that. Some children had laptops and PCs at home that enabled them to log on and to work. They had space, they had Wi-Fi and so on, and schools could offer it. Other schools simply didn't have, their staff weren't able to do it. The children, some children didn't have laptops, they didn't have broadband, or they had at home many brothers and sisters who also wanted to use the family laptop. The house was noisy and so on. So there was what we call a big digital divide between both at schools, what schools offered, and also what children could receive. And that was very concerning for a lot of us. And that lockdown continued till June, July time, when schools reopened gradually. They reopened to the youngest and the oldest children first. What we call public examinations, our A-levels and GCSEs, were cancelled in that time as well. It was a huge shock, I think, across the country. And what then happened is we have a long, what we call a summer holiday, a long break, and schools closed for 5 to 6 weeks. Now, we already have evidence that for some children, they slip back during the summer holidays. And in fact, part of the response to the pandemic was looking at what evidence there was about children's attainment when schools closed over the normal summer breaks. But in this case, some children had barely been back in school. They were back in school a couple of weeks and then the schools closed for 5 or 6 weeks. So it's very disruptive. The schools opened again in September as normal, and most schools did open. Some schools had to close because of infection rates, or they couldn't have enough. They didn't have enough teachers. Some classes were sent home, and so on. Children had to work in what we term bubbles. So a whole class might be a bubble, and that bubble of children and a teacher may not interact with other children in school, have different playtimes, and so on. So school was different for the children, but most schooling of some sort continued. And then we had the Christmas holidays, schools closed, and then we went straight into another lockdown. And this was for 8 weeks. So in summary, there was a lot of disruption. There was a lot more online teaching in the second lockdown in January and February 2021. Schools were more able to offer that to their children, but there was a lot of disruption. And at the same time as this was happening, at NFER, we were wondering what we would do. Some of our projects got cancelled. A lot of our projects got postponed. We could see what was going on in schools and were very concerned about the effect it would have on children's learning, and in particular, the effect on children who were least able to join online lessons, who were very young and therefore couldn't learn independently. So the one key thing happened at government level, and one key thing happened at NFER. So at government level, something called the National Tutoring Programme was established. And that has a large amount of government funding that is to enable schools to hire tutors who will then give individual and small group tuition to children who they think need that boost to their learning. And that was because we know that small group or one-to-one teaching is effective. It helps children catch up. So there was a big investment in that. NFER won a project to evaluate this programme as part of a consortium. I would have to say we're about to publish our first reports on this. It's been very challenging because the programme was rolled out during the pandemic, so things were changing and it was all very fast. and it's been a challenge simply to evaluate it. But what NFER particularly did was design a study that would focus on the teaching and the attainment of the very youngest children in school. These children are aged 5 to 7. So they are at that point in schools in England, and this is focused on in England, they are really having to learn their very basic skills. They'll have been in preschool provision, but we start in reception by doing a lot of work on teaching the children to listen, to take turns, to put their hand up if they want to ask a question, all the things that you need in order to go on and learn effectively in school. Skills, particularly in speaking, reading, writing, and mathematics. So there's a lot of work embedding those early skills. So in our project, which was funded by the Education Endowment Foundation, the EEF, and I put in my suggestions for follow-up, have a look at their website. It's a very interesting organisation based really on the What Works centres. So we tested the children, their reading and their mathematics at several different times during the pandemic. And in fact, we have a follow-on project. We're tracking these children now, and we're just about to do another report on them when they were 6, 7 and 8 years old as well. So it's ongoing. But there were two main things we wanted to know about these children. Were they achieving as highly as children who had not been in the pandemic when they started school? So did they do as well as children in previous years? And were there specific skills that they were missing? Were there gaps in their learning? So this is what we found out about these children. So by the end of the summer term in 2021, so this is the, I'd say towards the end, when restrictions were easing up, schools were much more established. They were not locking down, closing down, sending children home so much. But by the end of the summer term, we found that the 6-year-olds were 3 months behind where we would expect them to be in their reading. And they've only been in school at this point for 2 years, and they're already 3 months behind where we would expect them to be. Now that's an average. Some children won't be behind at all, and some children will be more than that behind. But on average, they were 3 months behind, and it's difficult to see without additional support how they make up that time. And this is what we don't really know, how much time they will be able to make up. The 7-year-olds, who of course had already had a complete year in school before COVID hit. So they were in year 1 when the pandemic started, and we tested them when they were in year 2. They were 2 months behind. So it looks as if it had had slightly less impact when they were a little bit older, but it was the very youngest children who were impacted the most. Now, the other thing that caused us considerable worry was the fact that in the UK, there is what we call a disadvantage gap. There is a very wide spread of achievement. We have some very, very capable, very high achieving learners, and we have some children who are really struggling, and there is a wide gap between them. And if that gap in particular, there is a gap between what we call disadvantaged children, and those children we define as eligible for a free school meal, and that's based on their family income. So these are the poorer children, and those children on average only, not every single poor child, but on average those children achieve less well than children who have a higher family income. And this is not uncommon worldwide, but the gap was about 7 months. And that's a huge gap, and it's bigger than in many other countries. And we are very aware of this as a problem in our education system. Now, 7 months is a bit, it had increased. It existed before the pandemic, what we call the disadvantage gap, but it increased during the pandemic. And that's a huge worry for us, because we've spent a lot of time and money and thinking and research into trying to narrow the gap, to try to lift the performance of the disadvantaged children before the pandemic. The Education Endowment Foundation does all sorts of studies to try to find out what can be done to enable these children to perform to their very best. And the pandemic has increased the gap. And it's very difficult to see that if we don't do anything, how that gap will close. So what we also looked at is the spread of achievement. So this is not to do with now the disadvantaged necessarily, but we looked at the spread of achievement, and we found, to me, perhaps certainly equally concerning of the disadvantage gap is the fact that the very low achievers, the proportion of very low achieving children increased a very great deal. So for the year 5-6, the year 1 children, we had double the number not able to really engage in the reading assessments. Their scores were mostly gained through guessing, maybe 1 or 2 questions correct, but mostly they couldn't do it. And for the year 2 children, the number that really couldn't show what they could do in the reading test, he didn't get very much, he looked and he thought, well, I don't really know what they can do. That proportion tripled. 3 times as many children failed to really register a score. So that means in every classroom, on average, instead of having, and the proportions are now, I think for the year 5-6, the proportions are something like 5.6% of children didn't register a score, and the year 6-7s, it's 7.5%, I think. So that means in every classroom, there's 2 or 3 children on average who are not really able to work independently. So they will need some sort of support. And what we also know is that if you don't catch these children early and what we call remediate, do something about helping them, then they will struggle with reading for many years. And if they struggle with reading, there's a lot of other problems that sometimes emerge, not with all of them, but with many of them. They lose confidence, they avoid reading. Sometimes they learn some bad behavior to avoid reading. They certainly struggle with writing. It affects, as I've said, their performance in all areas of their school life. So this is what I think in many ways educationally the most significant finding and very worrying. Now, what we also did was, rather than just look at the scores of the children, we looked at what mistakes they had made in order to see if it would give information for teachers. So generally, we found that if something had been hard for the children of that age before the pandemic, it remained hard now. So it wasn't that things that were difficult became easy and things that were easy previously became hard. It wasn't that. They roughly stayed about the same. What it seemed was that things were just delayed. So it wasn't something different, it was delayed. And we published some leaflets for teachers to help them with that. And finally, I'm just going to talk about the particular things that we looked at. So the particular weaknesses in the comprehension. So what we found was, even when children had learnt to what we call decode, they could recognise that the letter A makes an A sound and the letter T makes a T sound. Even when they knew the sounds, that they struggled to really understand it and get to the meaning. And this was in stories and in information texts as well. So one of the things that we suggest they do is they need to be spending more time reading, but not reading with someone. So they are answer their questions. So they're not just sitting looking at a book on their own, because that worried us that these children may not be understanding what they're reading. They need to have someone asking them questions or getting them to talk about their book. And this could be when they're on their own with an adult, or whether they're with a group of children and an adult, but they need to be interacting more rather than simply looking at the story or the information. That's not that they shouldn't read on their own or look at information books on their own, but it shouldn't be the only thing they do. They must do much more that means they're asked about what they're reading. One of the things that we found they were not doing is always thinking about the sense of what they were reading. So sometimes they would answer a question in the assessment with the first thing that they saw in a multiple choice, rather than reading the whole thing, reading to the end of the sentence, the end of the question. They just made a guess. And we felt that's something that comes with a bit of practice, but they needed support to do that. And then we also found, in terms of this was something the more able readers were not so good at than we would have hoped. And we see this definitely with older children as well. It's not entirely something with the youngest children. But they're not, if they read a whole, say they read a story, they then struggle with answering questions that are based on the reader knowing what the character, the point in the story that the character is at. The character's understanding evolves as the story progresses. And what's very clear is children sometimes struggle. So they will assume the character knows what they're going to find in a present they unwrap, because in the course of the story, the present gets unwrapped. So they think the character, when they're given a present, they know what's in it, because they, as a reader, do know what's in it when they get to the end of the story. But they don't realise that at the point in the story when the character gets the present, they don't know what's in the box, what's wrapped up in it. That's the sort of thing that we know they struggle with. So those are particular things that their teachers or their parents, their carers, can spend some time with them. So those are the sort of things that we have fed back to teachers. Now, more information is available here in the Education Endowment Foundation. If you search using those terms, Education Endowment Foundation plus COVID-19, you'll get our various reports. And also, if you search for where I work, National Foundation for Educational Research, we also have a series of reports about the response to the pandemic and some surveys and so on. And our latest one on mental health will be published in November as well. So I hope this is useful. Thank you very much. Goodbye.